Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. I'm Dr. Ian Lockie, and I teach Latin and Ancient Greek at Friends Select School close by on the Parkway. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Mary Beard of Cambridge University, author of S.P.Q.R, A History of Ancient Rome. For myself, as a student of classics, Mary Beard has an intimidatingly impressive CV. She completed a BA at Newnham College, Cambridge, and after a brief stint as lecturer at King's College, London, she returned to her alma mater, where she still teaches today. Her publishing career is vast and varied, and is noteworthy for her elucidation not just of major events in ancient history, but also her vivid narratives of daily life in the ancient world, which help to bring the past to life for classicists and non-classicists alike. Professor Beard's work covers such topics as late Republican Rome, Roman religion, art, the Parthenon, the Colosseum, the Roman triumph, the ancient town of Pompeii, and ancient laughter. Throughout these works, the reader is left with a sense not of how different the ancient world was from our own, a common perception, but how similar it was in many ways and how important it is that it still resonate with people today struggling to understand their own world. Her Parthenon was described as a work that brings impeccable scholarship to a wider audience. Her Pompeii is a vivid demonstration that skeptical scholarship can provide as gripping a reading as sensationalism. And her Confronting the Classics as a book that so expertly straddles the line between the scholarly and accessible. As a classroom teacher, I'm always trying to think of new ways to bring antiquity to life for my students. And Professor Beard's work encourages me to consider new perspectives of events in ancient history and how they should be taught. In addition to her many television documentary appearances, Professor Beard also contributes regularly as classical editor to the Times Literary Supplement, writing book reviews and updating her blog, A Don's Life, which discusses both ancient and modern concerns. Her 2013 work, Confronting the Classics, collects many of these essays together and highlights her deep understanding of the ancient world from the Bronze Age right the way through to post-classical reception of antiquity. In the same year, in 2013, she was recognized by the Queen with an Order for the British Empire for her services to classical scholarship. Her latest work, S.P.Q.R, takes on the daunting task of re-evaluating Rome from its earliest beginnings to the grant of universal citizenship in 212 CE. As the Guardian reviewer states of what he calls a masterful work, Beard makes us reconsider what we think we know about the Romans, a statement that rings true about all of her writing. As an undergraduate student at Cambridge University, I had the pleasure of witnessing firsthand Professor Beard's engaging lecturing style, so I can assure you all here tonight that you are in for a treat. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mary Beard to the Free Library.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming tonight on this slightly rainy evening, which makes me feel very much at home here in Philadelphia. I first went to Rome over 50 years ago. 40 years ago, in 1973. And I will remember back then that one of the things that struck me most vividly were not the ancient remains or the great Renaissance art, but the fact that still stamped on every manhole cover and on every lamppost and public trash can were the letters that 2,000 years earlier had stood as an abbreviation for the ancient Rome, the city of the ancient Romans themselves, the Roman state, really, itself. S.P.Q.R, Senatus Populusque Romanus, the Senate and the Roman people. And even now, as you can see, that is the symbol and logo of the modern city of Rome, and I reckon it must be the longest lasting acronym in the history of the world, right? And I would never have believed in 1973 that I would wind up just over 40 years later having written a big history of ancient Rome with exactly that title. And I'm here tonight to address perhaps the most obvious question that that book raises. To put it bluntly, why on earth do we need another history of ancient Rome? You know, aren't there quite enough already, right? Now, I hope this evening I can show you why we do need to keep going back to the Romans afresh, and to give you a little taste of what my version of the Romans looks like. Now, first reason that we need a new history is very simple. That is, new things about the ancient world are being discovered all the time. And ancient Rome is actually changing in very unexpected ways that a historian writing only 50 years ago, let alone Gibbon at the end of the 18th century when he was writing his Decline and Fall, in ways they could never have imagined. And it's often now, not always, but often, through the appliance of modern science. One of my favourite examples of that is the material that is actually being discovered in the Greenland ice cap, where in deep borings, core borings into the ice cap, scientists are bringing up great long kind of cores, I suppose you call them, of ice, which still contain, when you get down to the Roman levels, the ice that was formed in the Roman Empire, they still contain the analysable traces of the pollution left by the Roman industrial processes at a level that was not matched until about 2,000 years later. Now, I'm afraid I can't actually show you a picture of a core. I'm sure you can imagine it's just a long string of ice. And you may already have guessed that the analysis is a little bit more complicated than just bringing up this ice and looking for the black bits and saying, there it is. It's more complicated than that. But here, that's one of the fridges in which the ice cores are kept in Utrecht. You might say at this point, well, where does that pollution come from? And the answer to that is probably quite largely from Spain. The best guess is that what's really fueling this filth are the silver mines in Spain, which was actually the source of a vast majority of Roman silver coinage. What I can show you, though, is one of the skulls from Roman Britain, which is the subject of some equally cutting-edge science, which is actually beginning to help us track the migration and movement of people through the Roman Empire. Now, up to this point, we've had only some very tantalizing glimpses of the kind of mobility that the Roman Empire brought with it. And those are glimpses that often come from tombstones. This actually is one of the most intriguing of those glimpses. It's a tombstone from the north of Britain. First sight, there's not actually very much special about that. Portrait of the dead woman here, an inscription underneath explaining her life story. But if you look a bit closer, you see that it's a woman. Sadly, her face had all been bashed off, sitting on a chair, little treasure box here, and she's got her woolworking on her lap. But underneath, the text tells a rather more unexpected story. It explains that this woman was called Regina. That sort of means Queenie, I think, Queenie in modern English. She came from the south of Britain, from the Catalonian tribe, although she's actually dying up north near Hadrian's Wall. She was born a couple of 100 miles away. She'd been a slave, and she'd later been freed. She was a liberta. But interestingly, she'd married a man called Barates, who was from Palmyra in Syria, Palmyrinus. And he commemorates his wife, Queenie, first of all in Latin, but then underneath in his native Aramaic. Now, that raises all kinds of questions, as you can see, like what on earth is Barates doing in Britain, thousands of miles away from Palmyra? How on earth had he got hitched up with Queenie? My guess is he'd once been her owner, actually. He was a slave owner who freed her and married her. But right down to questions of what language do we think they spoke at home, right? They speak Palmyran? And also, I think the thing that struck me as I think about it a bit more, I wonder if these people looked odd in Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain. Did people say, ooh, there's that funny Palmyran man with Queenie? Or did they just fit in? Now, that's just, whatever lies behind it, and there must be an exciting story that we can't any longer get at. Whatever lies behind it, that is just one example of the mobility of people within the Roman Empire that we can now track much more widely through the analysis of skeletal remains. Back to the skull, because the giveaways, the scientific giveaways, are in the skulls and particularly in the teeth of the dead Romans that we find. Because the adult teeth still contain the chemical traces of the environment where the person was living when the teeth were forming in the jaw. Now, what you can do in the analysis is not yet hugely precise, but you can tell very clearly, for example, that a person must have grown up in a considerably warmer climate than the one in which they were found in their grave. Now, you can't tell where that warmer climate was. It might be the south of France or it might be North Africa, but it shows that they must have come from somewhere a long way away. And you can do that on skeletal material at a much wider level than you can do it if you just rely on a couple of tombstones. And it's beginning to tell us, in the context of Roman Britain, which I have to say is the most backwater province of the Roman Empire, which nothing really very interesting happened, even in Roman Britain, up to about 20% of those who died in the towns of Roman Britain, countryside we know nothing about really, up to 20% who died in the towns had grown up somewhere significantly different. Now, that for a pre-industrial empire is a mobility of populations on a really, really big scale. And that itself is starting to change our perception of how the populations of the Roman Empire actually lived, worked, and moved. But just to finish the new stuff, this is my favourite new discovery because it's a large sewer, or more correctly, I think it's a cesspit, that has been discovered in ancient Herculaneum, which is the town next to Pompeii, also destroyed in 79. And it's a cesspit underneath a small block of Roman apartments. And it is quite literally where everything from all the lavatories in the apartment block ended up, absolutely unmediated and unprocessed, and where, over 2,000 years, it gradually decomposed. Right? It is, in other words, what you find in this cesspit is the remains of everything that went into the mouth and through the digestive tracts of the ordinary people who were living above. And it's all been rediscovered, and bags and bags and bags of it are currently being analysed in Oxford as I speak. And it is giving us, actually I have to say, it sounds really awful, but actually it's just like sort of rather nice compost now when you figure, it doesn't feel excrementy like at all. But it's giving us enormous amounts of information of what these people were really eating, quite away from the fantasies of elaborate cookery and exotic delicacies that you find both in Hollywood movies but also in Roman literature itself. You know, dormice stuffed with anchovies in honey and that kind of thing. And the answer is these people, as you might have expected, but we can now show it to be true, are eating something much plainer and much healthier. They're eating loads of fruit, figs, pomegranates, apples, plus eggs, pork, chicken, and fish. And it's absolutely obvious that sea urchins were a very particular favourite, because there's lots of little bits, tiny little bits of the spikes of the sea urchins, which one imagines might have been slightly uncomfortable if they'd gone through the digestive tract, but never mind, they did. Now, these are all new things, or if they're not new things, they're new ways of getting information out of old things. And I'm going to be coming back at the end of this talk to one other new discovery. But at this point, I want to pause a bit and to say that new discoveries are not the main reason. They're one of the reasons, but they're not the main reason that you need a new history. I think it goes without saying that history isn't simply about uncovering the past, taking a look at it, and then moving on, job done. It's actually about carrying on a conversation with the past. And the different questions that succeeding generations want to raise and to put to the past give all kinds of different answers about what that history looked like, and they make a very different dialogue, and they generate a history afresh that works and speaks for us. History, in other words, a bit of a cliche, but it's always a work in progress. There's no such thing as a history that's definitive forever, nor actually are we better historians, I think, than our predecessors. We just have different interests from them. And Roman history is a very obvious case of that kind of moving on of the debate. And one thing that no one could miss, and it certainly changed dramatically during my lifetime, is how issues of Roman women, sexuality, and gender have been treated in mainstream history. To be honest, I think when I was a student, women didn't have much of a role in the grand narrative sweep of Roman history, which was largely about the policies, the aspirations, the deeds, the misdeeds, and the writing of rich Roman men. The only exception was in the family of the Roman emperor himself, where women were assumed to be the power, and usually the villainous power, behind the throne, and none was more villainous than Livia, the wife of the first emperor Augustus, who, as a jealous mother, is supposed to have got rid of everyone who stood in the way of her own son Tiberius rising to the throne. And in the end, she even killed her husband, the emperor, by, according to some Romans, an extremely clever strategy. Augustus, the emperor, was always obviously on his guard against poisoning, and so he had all the food at his table very carefully tasted by servants before he would touch it. So what Livia did was painted poison onto the figs as they grew on the trees in the palace gardens, because no one ever bothered to test for poison figs that they picked directly off the tree. And it made, don't know how many in the audience remember the old TV series with Sian Phillips as Livia, but it made a wonderful little camp incident in the old TV series that I particularly loved, when Sian Phillips as Livia, just after she's finally seen Augustus well and truly dead, turns to Tiberius, who's turned up, and just says, "Oh, by the way, don't touch the figs." it's partly the result of modern feminism that most historians now, not all of them, but most of them, don't take those kind of stories, which are told by ancient authors, quite so straight or quite so uncritically, even though they're actually found in ancient sources themselves. We are, I think, now much more aware of the way that for example, in highly patriarchal societies such as Rome, male fantasies often project crime and wicked scheming onto women who just happen to be near the centre of power. Women and transgressive female ambition is often used as an explanatory device by writers in such past societies as a way of explaining the accidents or the peculiarities of history. Somebody dies, and we say, oh, Livia poisoned him, right? He might just have had appendicitis, right? And of course, that hasn't, I've been saying, oh, look, patriarchal societies in the past. It's not entirely unknown in patriarchal societies in the present either. And I always think that there was certainly a touch of the Livia about the way the British press used to treat Sherry Blair. They would always say, the row between Blair and Gordon Brown, all because of Sherry, So, we're not entirely immune from this. So, when I'm writing now, I obviously tell a very different story because I've got those sort of issues in mind. And I certainly think if you read S.P.Q.R, you'll find rather fewer female poisoners than in any of the work of my predecessors. I should add, I suppose, at this point, that actually that title that I started with, S.P.Q.R, is also an attempt to rescue another group that's often ignored or abused in Roman history writing, both ancient and modern, senatus populusque Romanus, which is to say, by parading the people alongside the Senate, I'm trying to remind all of us that Roman history isn't just about the elite men in the Senate. There is a population there that the Romans saw as important, even if they've left much less traces of their activity. So I hope there's a fairer deal for women and a fairer deal for the people in this book. But the big example with which I start the book is one which I think has a particular modern resonance and is particularly interestingly inflected in modern political debate. It's a famous moment in 63 BC, when centre stage is Marcus Tullius Cicero. Here he is, orating like a Roman. One of the best-known Romans of them all. Volumes and volumes of Cicero's letters, speeches, philosophical essays, and even jokes still survive. Not to mention all those recreations like the recent trilogy of novels by Robert Harris, a British novelist, which put Cicero centre stage of this great story. Anyway, Cicero in 63 was consul, the chief annual elected official in Rome, and he believed that he had uncovered a terrorist plot to overthrow the government and to burn the city down. And it was led, so Cicero was certain, by a disgruntled aristocrat called Lucius Sergius Catilina, or just Catiline to us. And on the screen here is a 19th century painting which, appropriately enough, was commissioned to decorate the modern Italian Parliament building. Which shows Cicero in full flow, denouncing for his terrorist plots this rather moody Catiline here, next to whom no senator is obviously wanting to sit. He's been all left on his own. And it's a rather wonderful painting, although the Senate House was never this kind of semicircular creation with a vast column going somewhere up to the sky. The speech that we have to imagine Cicero is actually delivering here is one that in fact still survives. And it's been copied and studied and practiced ever since, and it's still on Latin syllabuses in schools and universities all over the Western world, and it's known as the first speech against Catiline, the first Catilinarian speech. And it is the speech in which he actually, as I say, says to the other senators in the presence of Catiline, that man is wanting to destroy the state. And it begins with what became one of the most famous bits of Latin quotation ever, which I've given you in Latin and English, quousque tandem abutere Catilina patientia nostra. How long will you go on, Catiline, abusing our patience? Come back to those words in a minute. The upshot of the speech, which is much longer than that little phrase, goes on for many pages, the upshot of this speech was that Catiline fled the city. Whether he was quite as guilty as charged, we shall probably never know, but he joined a makeshift army and was later killed in battle against the official forces of Rome, and he probably wasn't entirely innocent, however much Cicero had egged the whole case. And in Rome itself, Cicero rounded up the rest of those he believed to be in the plot, and he executed them without trial, claiming the justification of an early form of a Homeland Security or Prevention of Terrorism Act. After he had overseen the execution of the conspirators, he came to meet the public and he uttered just one chilling word about them. He said, "Vixere, they have lived," i.e., they're now dead. Right? They have lived in the past. Now, to start with, after this, Cicero was heroised as the saviour of the state, but soon, predictably, doubts began to arise over the legality of his actions. Because one of the fundamental principles of Roman citizenship was that the citizen, unlike the non-citizen, was entitled to a fair and free trial and could not be arbitrarily punished by any state official, no matter what crime they were suspected of. And Cicero soon found himself, briefly, only for a few months, but nevertheless, in exile on the charge of executing citizens without due process. And as he left town, his house was demolished and a shrine of the goddess Liberty was erected on its site. As I say, he was eventually, after a few months, allowed to return, but his career never reached the heights that it had before. Now, this dilemma, the Cicero versus Catiline dilemma, was debated ever after in Rome, and school kids used it as rhetorical practice exercises. But it doesn't take much to see the echoes or the prequel here of our own debates on almost exactly the same unanswerable question. How do you balance the security of the state against the rights of the individual citizen? Cicero versus Catiline is always, in my mind at least, when we turn to debate detention without trial, Guantanamo Bay, or most recently, the killing by British forces of British citizens fighting in Syria for ISIS. And if you want a nice glimpse of the topicality of this incident, just take a look at these Hungarian protesters of a couple of years ago. That's a little bit of a newspaper photograph, but they are actually blazoning on their banner Cicero's very words, quousque tandem. Right? Now, of course, the rights of Roman citizenship are not new in modern political debate. They're just constantly shifting and being re-inflected. If you go back 50 years to the middle of the Cold War and to John F. Kennedy, you'll find him exploiting the ideals of Roman citizenship for slightly different reasons in his Ich bin ein Berliner speech. There he is, giving the speech. 2,000 years ago, Kennedy insisted, the proudest boast was civis Romanus sum. I am a Roman citizen. Today, he went on, as we know, in the world of freedom, the proudest boast is Ich bin ein Berliner. One of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. But there is, however, a little sting in the tail that some classicists might recognise. What Kennedy or his speechwriters hadn't realised was that the most famous and most quotable use of that phrase, civis Romanus sum, in ancient Rome itself, had been a decidedly awkward one. They were the words repeatedly cried out from the cross by an unfortunate and entirely innocent citizen on the island of Sicily when he was being wrongly crucified by a rogue Roman governor. Even if guilty, Roman citizens were by law immune from such degrading punishment, so the man was desperately trying to claim his citizen rights. Civis Romanus sum, civis Romanus sum, he shouted. But it made not a blind bit of difference. He died in agony. There's a certain uncomfortable awkwardness, I think, between Kennedy blazoning civis Romanus sum with that background against Ich bin ein Berliner. And I think, and this is the theme, really, one of the themes of the book, I think one of the most important and interesting ways that modern issues in Roman history have repeatedly come together in different, I think often very different ways, is around the issue of what counts as a citizen. And I think now, without going into it, it's no surprise to find that we are sitting and looking at a crisis of migration and citizenship, particularly, but not only in Europe, which have another set of resonances with how the Roman Empire ran itself. I think it's worth saying the Romans would never have understood the term illegal migrant. And in fact, in their own mythology, they believed that their citizens, their earliest citizens, had in fact been a band of refugees, asylum seekers, and economic migrants. So it's another way that history kind of weaves itself together. But I want to spend just the very end of this talk going back to those new discoveries and sharing with you a rediscovery of my own. And one that, in fact, I made after S.P.Q.R. had gone to press, so it's not in there. And it's a nice indication, I think, of how new things about Rome not only turn up all the time, but also in very unexpected places. Okay, just to set the context of this discovery. One of the questions that I address in the book is the tricky issue of when Rome became Rome. That's to say, the place starts off in the 9th or 8th centuries BC as a small, very ordinary little place. To be honest, it's a bit of a dump, and it's by the Tiber. When does it become the Rome that we know, with the institutions and the ways of doing things and the expansionist tendencies that we recognise as distinctively Roman? When, if you like, does Rome become the S.P.Q.R. of my title? Now, I'm not going to give away all the answers to that, but I don't think it spoils the read if I say that I'm pretty clear that the really key formative or transformative period is not actually until the 4th century BC, 4 centuries into the city's history. And alongside that, I'm pretty clear that the first Romans we encounter, who are really more historical than mythical, and certainly the first we have any direct primary evidence for, lived around the turn of the 4th and the 3rd centuries BC. And the first one of all of those really historical characters, who's quite a hero in my 4th chapter, is a man from one of the most prominent Roman families of all. His name is Scipio Barbatus, and I like him because he means Scipio Beardy or Scipio Longbeard. And he was consul in 298 BC, at a time when Rome had gained control of much of the Italian peninsula and was just on the cusp of expanding overseas. His descendants, men like Scipio Africanus and Scipio Aemilianus, went on to be some of the most successful, or bloodstained, if you see it that way, Roman conquerors of the lot. Africanus and Aemilianus between them sent Hannibal and the Carthaginians packing very brutally. Now, almost all the traces that we can find of Barbatus, as I shall now call him, look very archaic and would have looked that way to later Romans too. But at the time, he was a hugely innovative representative of a new Rome. And among other things, he was the first to build himself a big family tomb on the first big road that was ever built out of the city, the Appian Way. And this is Piranesi's rather imaginative version of what it looked like in the late 18th century. I can't see how it possibly could have, actually. But it is a place, however, that you can still visit. And this is what Barbatus's family tomb looks like inside. It's all quite spooky. And this is a slightly downhill exterior with a friend of mine doing her iPhone. And this is the actual sarcophagus of Scipio Barbatus himself. And inscribed on its front is what is effectively the first mini-biography of any Roman to survive. And it's extraordinarily revealing of the ideology of the period. We don't know exactly when Barbatus died, but a good guess is the 280s BC. So we're still 250 years from the assassination of Julius Caesar. And just very briefly, here are the words on it, which I think speak for themselves. You've got his name, Cornelius Lucius Scipio Barbatus, born of his father Gnaeus, his virtues. He was a brave man, a wise man, whose appearance was equal to his virtue. Slightly odd thing to say about Romans, but you had to cut a dash, obviously. His offices, consul, censor, and aedile amongst you, and then his military record. He captured Tarasia, Cizorna, and Samnium. He subdued all Lucania and took hostages. And that's it, right? Now, you can see what I mean when I say that Romans now had become Romans. But there's another story here that I've been tracking down in the last few weeks, and which lead right back to Barbatus himself. And that is the story of the tomb's uncovering in the late 18th century, in 1780 to be precise. The excavation was something of a cause célèbre because it was sponsored by Pope Pius VI, who took all the stuff worth having back to the Vatican, raising a considerable number of questions about whether the church really should be disturbing the last resting place of the dead, even if they were pagan. So when you visit now, even this coffin, which you see in the tomb, is an exact replica. The coffin itself, the original, is in the Vatican museums. Now, it was partly all that controversy about what Pope Pius was up to that gave the tomb huge fame in the late 18th and early 19th century and made it one of the tourist hotspots of the city of Rome, which it certainly is not now. And replicas of Barbatus's coffin crop up in all kinds of unlikely places. Here is one in Highgate Cemetery. You can see, go back here, and there it is. You can see that that is a dead ringer for that. It's commemorating a female novelist. And you're all, I hope, going to know this one, because this is in a cemetery in this town. This is in Laurel Hill Cemetery, Philadelphia, and it's another replica of Scipio Barbatus's tomb. You can see the distinctive rosettes on it. That's got slightly squashed in my picture here. It's Commodore Isaac Hull. And if you actually go to the Protestant cemetery at Rome now, you can find no fewer than 9 coffins of Scipio Barbatus' tomb, not quite in a row, but almost. And if in the 19th century you didn't fancy being buried in one, you could always turn it into what every 19th century gentleman wanted for his desktop, which is a Scipio Barbatus inkwell. You lift off the lid, and there's the place for the ink. Right? But it doesn't take long to see there's another question lurking here. If the Pope took the coffin of Barbatus, then what happened to his mortal remains? And people were worried about disturbing the dead, but where had the dead actually gone when the Pope did all this? Now, sort of answer to that, it seems that the bones themselves ended up in an elaborate villa garden in Padua after they'd been given by the Pope to a well-known Venetian, a man called Senator Querini, who incorporated them into his philosophical garden at his villa at Altichiero. Now, that is a drawing of the last resting place, eventually, of the bones of Barbatus. I don't quite understand what the phallic symbols are doing on both sides, but that is the only drawing we have, because sadly the garden was destroyed, and I haven't yet discovered what happened to these, or to poor old Barbatus's bones when the garden was destroyed. There was something else. On his finger, Barbatus, this man, this consul with 298, had been wearing his signet ring. He'd taken his signet ring to his tomb, and it didn't go to Padua with the bones. But the Pope gave it to a French scholar, one Monsieur Duton, who'd happened to have written on the Scipio family, so the Pope thought it was an appropriate present. And Monsieur Duton later sold it or gave it to the English Lord Berkeley. And in the late 19th century, through a combination of sale and inheritance, Barbatus's ring ended up in the collection of the Dukes of Northumberland at Alnwick Castle, where Harry Potter was partly filmed, and Downton Abbey. And after the end of the 19th century, the trial goes cold and it doesn't get mentioned. So when I emailed the Duke's administration at Alnwick, I didn't really expect that Scipio Barbatus's ring would still be there. But after a certain ducal delay, I got an email back to say, indeed, the ring was still in the Duke's possession, and indeed, here it is, the ring that Scipio Barbatus took with him to his tomb. It's plain gold, and appropriately enough, for one of this new generation of Roman conquerors, it's got the personification of the figure of victory at its centre. But for me, I have to say there is a bit more a special thrill about finding this. Because this must count, I think, as the only bit of Roman jewellery that we can match up with a known historical owner. It's the only ring with a name attached. And where does it turn up? In a British medieval castle. And if I wasn't here actually in the United States at the moment, I think I would be hot-footing up to Alnwick and hoping that they'd let me try it on. That's very exciting. But one thing's for sure. If S.P.Q.R. is lucky enough to get a second edition, this is going to be in it. But anyway, until that time, you saw it first, and thank you very much for coming.
Hi, I want to thank you for speaking. It was very interesting. So it might be a bit of a weird question, but could you just talk for a minute on the importance of spices in Roman society? I find it fascinating. So,
once about the importance of spices, I can talk for a few minutes about that. Partly because I have actually become interested in it. And one thing that I ought to have said about the sewer and the cesspit is that I think there was a trace or two of pepper in it. So I think what is absolutely clear is that the Roman palate was being most enormously enlivened from about the 1st century BC onwards by Roman links with what I would call rather old-fashionedly the Far East. And it's absolutely clear that there are very, very strong trading links with the south of India, where large numbers of Roman coins have been found. And if you go to some of the Roman ports on the eastern desert in Egypt, where it's quite difficult, I have to say, to go currently, you find literally pounds and pounds remaining of peppercorns that have been imported from India. So it is a mark, I think in some ways spices do get to be, first of all, a mark of elite dining, but they're much more widespread than that. And that the Romans are really profiting by a Far Eastern trade, which is changing everybody's palate, I think.
Well, what is your take on why Rome declined and fell?
So, I got two. One, I will answer that question. But my first remark is going to be, I always get so cross. Everybody wants to know why it declined, when I want to know why it rose, right? My answer to that, though, to that fascinating question is that, it's got nothing to do with lead in the water pipes or too much sex or too little sex or whatever it's supposed to have had. I think answer number one is that in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, it didn't decline and fall until 1453. So, although we call the eastern part of the Roman Empire in its medieval version, we call it Byzantium, it is actually, and they call themselves the Romans. So part of it goes on for another 1,000 years or more after my book stops. I think that in the West, obviously there is a tremendous difference, and Rome itself, the city of Rome, is no longer commanding the western part of the Roman Empire. And I think there are quite a lot of things that underpin that, including the long-term consequence of making everybody a citizen. It's actually surprisingly destabilising, I think, not the other way around. But I think also, even there, it's a process not of the fall of Rome, but of the disaggregation of Rome. And the conventional image we have of, nasty barbarians of no culture whatsoever coming and destroying the great cities of the West is completely wrong. You get really what some people call a series of mini-Romes. And they're mini-Romes that don't have the same political power, but they still largely speak Latin. They write Latin poetry of considerable expertise. They continue the work of Roman law codes. And they think of themselves in some ways as inheritors of Roman culture. So in some ways, I think the picture of something which caused this huge edifice to collapse, it didn't collapse actually in quite the way that we often assume. I mean, that's not to say things didn't change, particularly in the West, but they changed in a slightly different way from our assumptions.
On the question of why Rome rose, was there a particular event, series of events, or a trend that if it had not happened a certain way, Rome would not have risen?
I think it's really, really impossible to say for sure. And I got more and more interested in that question in the course of writing this book. And it is one place where one's a bit flawed by the lack of evidence. That's to say, if you look at the beginning of the 4th century BC, it's not much to look at, but Rome at that point doesn't look anything special. By the end of the 4th century BC, they've conquered vast swathes of Italy, and they've got people like Scipio Barbatus looking Roman. So I became convinced that whatever happened in the 4th century BC. That it starts off with business as usual, and at the end of the century, Rome is not an ordinary state. And there are various hints, but there are only hints in the middle of some of the key institutions that we know, like the Senate actually really being formed for the first time. But what it was that kick-started that, I said to a sociologist friend of mine who works on empire, in the end, and he said I wasn't necessarily exactly wrong, in the end, you just feel they got lucky. They just had a series of lucky breaks. And although that seems like a terribly unhistorical way of seeing it, and it would be nice to think that one could do something more, a greater explanation, a firmer explanation, I'm not sure I can. 396 BC, they get beaten by the Gauls. The Gauls come down and thrash them. And a lot of people want to say, once the Gauls had thrashed them, then they saw that they really had to get on their mettle, and that is what kick-started it. Well, I don't know whether that's any better an explanation than saying they got lucky.
Great. So I was just wondering, if you were to have, say, like 2 sculptures, one is being Greek and one being Roman. I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is, how can you tell if art is distinctly Roman?
I think it's almost impossible to tell whether art is distinctly Roman. And I think that, and when I started out doing Greek and Roman art at college, I was still brought up in the era of Greek art was really damn good. And the Romans were pretty hopeless. And little by little, they did manage to do a pretty decent copy of some of the stuff that the Greeks did. Right? And, over the last 40 years, that view now looks, it not only looks extremely crude, it doesn't actually match up to some of the extraordinary works of art that we can see the Romans producing. And I suppose I say, look, actually, it's apart from 1 or 2 hotspots in, say, the Athenian 5th century, Greco-Roman art has always been something of an amalgam. Even early Italy, when the Romans are being a very hip little cattle town, there's still quite a lot of contact, or there is already quite a lot of contact with the Greek world. And in some way, and I'm sorry to overuse this term conversation, most Roman art is in conversation with Greek art, but it's doing something different. The Greeks never built Trajan's column. The Greeks never do portraiture in the way Romans do. On the other hand, Roman portraiture is certainly reflecting various stylistic features of Greek art. So I think it's a tremendous conversational buzz the whole time. And that one thing one can knock on the head is that, Rome often does make versions of Greek sculpture. But it's very different to say, look, this is a rather postmodern creative imitation, and to say, this is a really dreary copy that the Romans are doing only because they can't do anything better. Now, actually, they're talking to Greek art. They're sometimes capping it. They are redoing it. They are playing with it. They're parodying it. And sometimes they're bettering it. I think would be my...
Right, thank you.
So my question sort of comes about because when I read your book on Pompeii, something I found really striking was the way you talk about how the streets are actually very dirty, and the way that a lot of people live is actually sort of lowbrow compared to the way I think Rome is presented to the general public, where we have these grand ideas and we're getting these really beautiful images of these buildings and these rich men. But in reality, the life for a lot of people is not like that. And so I'm wondering, how important you think it is for us as classicists and people who study Rome to present that version instead, because I think the really grand version sells very well, but it's not the reality of...
Yes, I think it's very important. I think we have to say to people, get real. And I think there's two sides of that. One is, just look, go to Pompeii. Why are there stepping stones across the streets and high pavements? That is not just a kind of interesting little quirk. That is because the streets are filthy, and sometimes the streets actually are torrents of rushing water when it rains. This is, Roman engineering is amazing, but it has extraordinary lapses, and in Pompeii there's no underground drain. But I think there's also, what's interesting is a chronological interest here. Because, if you say to people, oh, shut your eyes and think of Rome, they'll conjure up the version that you suggest, planned city, marble, grand buildings, the Hollywood image of Rome. Now, I think you're right to say that never really existed in that form. But insofar as it did exist, it's much later than people imagine. It doesn't exist until the 1st century AD and the period of major sponsorship by emperors. When Rome was conquering the world, or its world, the Rome of Cicero, that's why the picture of Cicero in the Senate House is so wrong, because at that point there was hardly any marble in Rome. Cicero's Rome, in some ways the acme of the Free Republic. Cicero's Rome was dirty, squalid, unplanned, built of brick, falling down. It was a rabbit warren. When somebody like Cleopatra, who did occasionally come to Rome partly to see Julius Caesar, she came from Alexandria, a city who'd seen better political days, but was a really planned city. It probably also had slums, but there were bits of it that were really planned and grand and sparkling in parts. She must have looked at Rome and thought, what is this place? And yet it was that place, the rather low-rise, low-key, dirty, squalid city that already had 1 million people and had conquered the world. So I think there's two things here. One is just the basic principle that we tend not to see the poor, and we fall for the Roman mirage, but also we get the chronology mixed up. We imagine, just like Maccari did when he did that painting, that Cicero, when he orated, would have orated in a grand building. He wasn't. He was standing in a squalid little temple when he said that. So, yes, I agree.
Your point about luck, do you see a continuum from the Peloponnesian War and the fall of Athens through the rise of Rome? So the question really is, but for the result of the Peloponnesian War, where Athens no longer could compete, did it affect Rome?
Very tangentially, I do. But there's what that scheme, sort of the fall of Athens and the Peloponnesian War and the rise of Rome misses out, is the Macedonians in the middle. And what Rome really does is move, or is brought, sometimes they are actually pushed into the squabbles and tensions and the power gaps in the Greek world that followed the death of Alexander the Great and the division of the Macedonian kingdom into a series of mini kingdoms. So you could say fall of Athens, growth of Philip II, Alexander's campaigns, death of Alexander, splitting of Alexander's territories into 4 warring factions, in a way, into which Rome then comes and in the end takes over the lot. So remotely, yes.
Now you know why we needed another history of Rome. Please join me in thanking Mary Beard.